I'd been looking forward to this free day from work for weeks, a rare break in my usual hectic schedule as a business traveler. With no meetings or deadlines to rush to, I decided to take advantage of the opportunity and explore a hiking trail I'd heard about during my stay in Ohio. The trail was a 6-hour loop through the woods, offering solitude and peaceful views, just the kind of escape I needed. The weather was perfect, overcast, with a slight breeze. The trail was quiet, with only a few distant hikers scattered along the path. I was alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I relished the thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional chirp of birds. It was about halfway into my hike when I encountered the first strange thing. A man was lying by the trail, almost as if he had fallen asleep or passed out. He was a middle-aged guy, wearing an old jacket and jeans. I didn't think much of it at first. People often stop on trails to rest or take in the views, so I gave him a wide berth and continued on my way. But something about him felt off. As I got closer, I noticed his eyes flutter open. He stared at me without saying a word, his expression blank. It was uncomfortable, but I chalked it up to the usual trail eccentricities. Maybe he was just tired or didn't want to engage. But as I walked past him, he suddenly called out, his voice gravelly. "Hey, you got a second?" I froze, unsure how to respond. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't exactly in the mood to chat with a stranger, especially not on a lonely trail like this. But something about his tone made me pause. "Can you help me out?" he asked, sitting up slowly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet. "I'm low on cash. You mind helping me out with a few bucks?" I should have kept walking. The moment felt wrong, like a red flag I should have heeded. But something about his tired eyes and his voice made me hesitate. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the isolation, but I fumbled through my pockets and handed him some cash. Nothing much, just a couple of bills. He took the money but then held up his wallet, now open in his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice taking on a strange edge. "I thought I had more in here." I glanced at the wallet, and my heart skipped a beat. It was empty. I'd just given him my last cash, and he'd asked for more. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Wait a minute," I said, backing up a few steps. "You said—" But before I could finish, his expression shifted. His calm demeanor faltered, and he stood up quickly, moving closer to me. Something about it felt like a trap. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was too late. The man suddenly reached for my bag, and in that instant, I realized I needed to get out of there. I turned and bolted down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the crunch of footsteps behind me, growing louder. I had to think fast. As I reached a clearing where the trail intersected with a dirt road, I spotted a parked car in the distance. Just one car, abandoned on the side of the road. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, desperately trying to open the passenger door. I managed to slip inside just as I heard the man's footsteps behind me, crashing through the brush. The moment I was inside, I locked the door and saw him approaching the car, his face twisted in frustration. He wasn't expecting me to make it this far. I could see his shadow through the window, standing by the driver's side, watching me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone to call the police, but as I dialed, I saw him duck behind the car, out of sight. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't notice me still inside. After what felt like an eternity, I heard his footsteps retreat, slowly at first, then picking up pace until he was out of earshot. I stayed hidden for another few minutes before cautiously getting out and running the rest of the way back to the trailhead, where I finally found help. The police responded quickly. They found no sign of the man, but they took my report seriously. They told me it was a common tactic for thieves to stalk solo hikers, making them believe they were offering help before pulling a scam, or worse. I was shaken, but at least I had escaped. From then on, I always carried protection when I hiked alone. The wilderness no longer seemed like an escape. It felt like a trap waiting to close in, and I would never look at an empty wallet the same way again. I had always been the type of hiker to stick with groups, never venturing out alone. But for some reason, I felt compelled to challenge myself that weekend. I knew the trail well. It was a popular loop, a day-and-a-half hiking route through the dense woods, the kind of trail I'd done countless times with friends. But this time, I would be alone. I set off early in the morning, the cool air and fresh scent of pine filling my lungs as I trekked through the familiar path. The first few hours went smoothly, with nothing more than the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. The trail was quiet, and I appreciated the solitude. It gave me space to think, to reflect. It was a break from the usual rush of life. By midday, I was about halfway through my journey when I encountered the man. He was standing off the trail, seemingly just looking out at the forest. He didn't have a backpack or any gear that indicated he was hiking. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it at first. I was just happy for a brief conversation with someone on the otherwise silent path. "Hey there," I called out, approaching cautiously. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You hiking alone?" His voice had a strange edge to it, almost too casual for someone who clearly wasn't prepared for a hike. I nodded, but something about him gave me pause. "Yeah," I replied, "but I'm meeting a group up ahead." They're just a few hours behind me. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at me with a blank expression. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, suspicion, maybe. But I brushed it off as my own anxiety. I was alone for the first time on this trail, after all. My nerves were getting the best of me. "All right," he said, almost too slowly, and turned to walk in the opposite direction, disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a moment, watching him, before continuing on my way. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him trailing behind me. The thought made me uneasy, but I brushed it aside. After all, I was just being paranoid. This was a familiar trail, one I'd hiked many times before with no incidents. By the time dusk began to settle over the forest, I was far enough off the main path to set up camp for the night. The area was quiet, isolated enough that I felt relatively safe. I pitched my tent, got my gear inside, and settled in for the night. The first few hours were peaceful, but just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my tent. I froze. It wasn't the kind of sound you hear from animals. It was too deliberate, too human. Someone was walking around my tent, just outside the thin fabric. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to stay perfectly still. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and calculated. Whoever it was knew exactly where I was. Minutes turned to hours, and the footsteps never stopped. Occasionally they would stop altogether, as if the person was waiting for something or someone, and then, just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, the footsteps would start again. There was no way to tell how many people were out there, or if it was the same man I had met earlier. But the growing sense of unease in my gut told me it didn't matter. I was being watched. By the time the sun began to rise, the footsteps stopped. There was no more movement around my tent, and the forest was eerily still. I waited, listening for anything, any sign that I was in danger. But when nothing came, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. I was immediately hit with the cold morning air, my breath misting in the chill. But what caught my attention wasn't the weather. It was the set of footprints around my tent. They weren't my own. They were fresh, leading off in the direction of the trail. Someone had circled my camp all night. Someone who had known exactly where I was. My blood ran cold. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I tied down the tent and shoved everything into my backpack. I didn't dare linger. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I made my way back to the main trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. As I hiked the rest of the way out, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following me. I never spoke to anyone about that night, but I changed my hiking habits for good. I no longer went on solo hikes, no longer trusted the quiet isolation of the trail. There were people out there watching, waiting, and I'd learned the hard way that not all hikers were there for the same reasons I was.